Gracias a todos por venir. Bueno, la conferencia la voy a dar en inglés porque me cuesta hablar un poco en castellano sobre esto, pero es la primera vez también que lo voy a presentar, así que podemos debatir y me podéis hacer muchas preguntas porque además es un experimento de laboratorio, entonces es un poco controversial. Entonces me podéis preguntar todo lo que queráis y podemos debatir porque una hora, yo creo que da tiempo suficiente y es la primera vez, de hecho, que presento esto. Okay. Muchas gracias de nuevo por venir. Entonces, so the title of this project is The Impact of Group Identity on Social Responsibility and Welfare in Experimental Markets. So what we are doing here is using a lab experiment. What we are going to do is we are going to induce group identities or social identities in the lab. And we are going to study what is the impact of inducing group identities among the participants in the lab on social responsibility in markets. So as we are going to explain later how we induce identity, we will divide people in the lab in teams. And in these teams, they have to solve a common problems task together. And so this is the way that they improve their sense of belonging together. They have to win these identities through a common solving task. And then we are going to study what is the impact on social responsibility. So what I mean with social responsibility in experimental markets, we develop an experimental market where there are buyers and sellers that can trade a fair good or an unfair good. If they decide to trade the fair good, there's no negative externality to a third party. But if they decide to trade an unfair good, they will impose an externality, a negative externality to a third party that is also present in the lab. I will explain later. So this is the basic idea of the experiment. So I will talk a bit about the motivation of the paper. So if we see the real world, we see that there is a correlation between the degree of social homogeneity in a society and various economic indicators. For example, if you see Alessina La Ferrara for an overview, they talk a lot about economic growth and social homogeneity. So they say that societies that are very homogeneous, they tend to grow more. Okay. And more relevant to my paper, I give you here an example that is countries that are homogeneous, that have homogeneous societies tend to present a more egalitarian income distribution. So here I made this figure just as a way of example. If it goes, no. So here I constructed a figure where in the x-axis I included the Gini inequality income in countries, and I use data from 6 years, the last 6 years, because sometimes they don't have the data in a certain year in certain countries. And here I use the fractionalization index developed by Alessina that measures the level of homogeneity in a society in terms of ethnicity, culture, language, etc. So the higher the index, the more fractionalized the society is. So more heterogeneous is. So we see that in general, countries with more income inequality tend to be more heterogeneous. And countries with more egalitarian distribution of income, they are more homogeneous in terms of culture. And I argued the following question. I also thought about social responsibility in markets. So here we have a poll about willingness to buy environmental friendly products in Europe. This is a poll for the income statistics of the European Union. So basically it's only about developed countries. And we see that countries that tend to be more more homogeneous tend to be willing to buy more environmental friendly products. So I asked myself why this is the case. One potential explanation is that societies that are very homogeneous, you care more about people around you in your society, so you are willing to buy more local products, for example. Instead of buying in Amazon, you decide to buy local products because you have a sense of common belonging with other people in your society. So instead of buying Amazon, you decide to buy local products that in general are more environmentally friendly because there are no transportation costs, etc. So we see here a negative correlation between more homogeneous societies tend to buy more environmental products. But obviously this is only correlations, right? We cannot conclude any causal relation, right? So we cannot conclude any causal relation from these real-world correlations. They are just correlations. And why? The more evident example is the correlation between market-responsible attitudes and cultural proximity. So what happened with this is that obviously consumers in wealthier countries generally are able to buy more responsible purchasing options because they have more money, right? But in fact, the GDP per capita of a country is highly correlated with cultural proximity, right? So it may be the case that it's just GDP per capita that affects social responsibility and not cultural proximity. The idea is cultural proximity and GDP per capita are highly correlated. So this correlation between social responsibility and social proximity may be caused by just the GDP per capita, okay? So how we solve this problem? Obviously, real world is complex with many interconnected variables. So determining any causal implication is always challenging and controversial, okay? Because there are many interconnected variables. So that's why we decided here to follow an experimental approach using a lab experiment where we have the environment totally controlled. Okay? So what we do in this paper, to sum up, using a lab experiment, we try to uncover the causal impact of introducing group identities. So as a proxy of cultural proximity, in the real world, we induce identities in the lab, okay, to enhance the common belonging between participants. And we study what is the impact of these group identities on social responsibility in markets. I will explain more in detail what I mean with social responsibility in markets, but it means basically buy products that do not impose negative externalities to other parties. So we study the causal impact of group identities on social responsible behavior. And because we are on markets, because we are in a market environment, we also care about the price levels. And we will see that price levels are also affected. And this will have an impact on income inequality. So price levels will affect income inequality between the members in the market. And socially responsible will affect efficiency of the markets.
Entiendo que implica confianza e identidad de grupo con identidad cultural. Y eso creo que tiene muchos riesgos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, coge un ejemplo cualquiera que puede ser los estudiantes en una escuela importante como puede ser la LCI o tu facultad, ¿no? Tus estudiantes pueden tener, culturalmente pueden ser muy diversos, y sin embargo tienen una identidad de grupo como estudiantes, o como Silicon Valley, es un ejemplo de diversidad cultural enorme, y sin embargo hay una identidad de grupo que son investigadores o técnicos. Por eso creo que sería importante no mezclar identidad cultural con identidad de grupo o con confianza. Trust.
Sí, bueno, teníamos la duda de, obviamente es más fácil inducir... Sí, es obvio que es muy distinto, porque identidad cultural yo estoy entendiendo algo mucho más profundo.
que en una facultad tienen una identidad de grupo, intereses comunes, quieren aprender, quieren conseguir lo mismo, y en el laboratorio no vas a replicar eso. Y eso no tiene nada que ver con la identidad cultural como yo la estoy entendiendo. A lo mejor la entiendo mal, pero...
Sí. Teníamos varias opciones para... Obviamente es difícil to mimic identidad cultural con cómo hacerlo en el laboratorio. Teníamos varias opciones, ¿no?
Identidad cultural. Llamarla identidad de grupo o confianza.
Era para vender un poco el paper un poco más en general, ¿no? Dudábamos si vender el paper como más general, hablando más del mundo real, o hacerlo más abstracto, digamos. Y hemos intentado...
Se habla de identidad de grupo, cuando se hacen este tipo de experimentos.
Sí, por eso. A lo mejor no, pero era para... Pero digo, como... No, sí, pero es buena pregunta porque era como, vendemos el paper solo como de manera abstracta, hablar de identidad de grupo, cuál es el efecto en social responsibility, o intentamos ir más allá y decir que es una... Por ejemplo, sí, when we induce, we had another option that I considered, but finally we decided to use group identities, but the other way would be induce trust in the lab. There are many experiments where they play trust games. So the other option would be instead of induce group identities, induce trust among the members of the, but I'm not sure what is closer to social homogeneity, trust among people or group identity. Because trust and is also very, because I had a slide here with trust. Here is trust. Most people can be trusted in a society and willingness to buy environmental products. And even with income inequality is even stronger. Sorry?
La confianza puede ser inducida por otros factores. No tiene nada que ver con la... No te queda más remedio que confiar, porque si te desvías te van a dar. La ley te lo impide. Estás en un círculo en donde se espera que actúes así. No puedes... Te confío en que lo vas a hacer porque eres alumno de la facultad, o porque eres profesor de la facultad, o porque la ley te lo impone. Y entonces esa confianza puede venir dada por sociedades en donde salirse del marco es muy costoso. Y por tanto confías. Porque no crees que nadie vaya a...
Bueno, yo creo que en ese tipo de sociedades, si te hacen una encuesta privada, no confías en la gente. Por lo que vi en esas encuestas de trust, normalmente ese tipo de sociedades que estás describiendo, la gente no confía en los demás. Normalmente son las sociedades más avanzadas.
Las acciones que se esperan
por ejemplo, China. Las encuestas en China, la gente no confía. Si miras el gráfico, most people can be trusted. En China dicen que no. Porque yo también dudaba en eso y no. Bueno. Es interesante. So we decided to induce group identities and study the impact on social responsibility in markets, in price levels, because we are in markets, and also in income inequality and efficiency. So what we did, we developed an experimental market framework with negative externalities. There are sellers and buyers that choose between offering a fair or an unfair product. Okay? And when the unfair product is traded, a negative externality is imposed to a third party that is present in the lab. Then I will explain. So we induce group identities, I will explain later, following the Chen and Lee procedure that basically they have to solve a common solving task together, okay? And we vary whether third parties share a common or a different identity than buyers and sellers. Then I will explain the treatments better, okay? Pues primero dividimos a los participantes en el experimento en dos grupos. No, es lo mismo. Sí, bueno, ahora ya lo puedo explicar. Inducir identidad de grupo significa que primero dividimos a los participantes en dos grupos. Uno rojo y otro verde. Y después tienen que resolver un problema juntos. Que en particular observan... Tengo aquí la diapositiva. They observe 6 paintings, 3 from the artist Kandinsky and 3 from the artist Klee, and they have to discuss the paintings together in a chat box. They discuss the paintings in a chat box together. So this way they induce identity, and then individually we put another 2 paintings, and they have to individually solve who did the painting. Entonces, básicamente, hablan sobre los 6 cuadros, 3 de Klee y 3 de Kandinsky, en un chat, y después de 5 minutos tienen que acertar quién pone esos otros 2 cuadros y tienen que acertar quién hizo Klee y quién hizo Kandinsky. Y reciben £1 por acierto. De esa forma induces como una sensación de common belonging together. Es como la proxy de una sociedad que es más homogénea o una sociedad donde hay trust, donde hay confianza.
Lo que decía Jaime, ¿son exógenos los grupos o ellos después se vinculan en función?
No, es todo exógeno, por eso es la...
Es aleatorio, no hay ninguna característica.
No, es aleatorio.
¿Cómo filtrar? ¿Les da información del estilo de filtrar?
Sí, lo que hablan es... Sí, uno tiene unos contornos más así y otros más...
Por esa información que es independiente en un grupo que en otro.
Sí, por eso. Unos tienen una sensación de pertenecer a un grupo. Eso es lo que queremos hacer. So, I don't want to talk much about the literature review, but we contribute to the experimental literature in 2 branches. One is in the determinants of socially responsible behavior of consumers and producers. And the other is the effect of group identities on individual behavior and on economic outcomes. Okay, so let's talk about the experimental design. So the experimental design has 2 parts. In the first part, we use group identities. As I said, the identity stage, what I explained to you, they solve a common problem together. And then in the second part, the participants interact in the market game that I will explain now for 12 rounds. Okay? And I will explain later, but there we have 3 treatments. The no identity treatment is where, obviously, to compare the baseline treatment that we compare is where there's no identities, okay? Then ID is where we introduce identities, where buyers, sellers, and third parties belong to the same group, okay? In ID out, we vary the third parties. So basically, buyers and sellers belong to the same group, but third parties, the ones who suffer the externality, belong to a different group. And why so? So, for example, in the ID treatment, buyers, sellers, and third parties belong to the same team. I think this would mimic in the real world where you buy local products. You can decide to buy a local product because the third party belongs to the same identity than you. Instead of buying in Amazon to someone far away, you buy because you care about the third party, you buy the product from with the same identity. And ID out would mimic the case where buyers and sellers are in the same country, but the third party is someone, for example, from Colombia that they sell a fair trade product. Obviously, the third party is from a different identity than you. So we try to mimic this case where you decide to buy fair trade products, for example. So let's play the market game. That is the more important. There are 4 sellers, 3 buyers, and 3 third parties. So basically, there's competition. There are more sellers than buyers, okay? And there are 3 third parties. And the role of each participant is kept fixed for all the rounds. And it is a 2-stage game. So first, the sellers simultaneously and independently choose the type of product and the price they want to offer the product. So basically, the type of product, they can choose between a fair or an unfair product. If it is a fair product, as I said, there's no externality, but it has a cost of production of 10. But if they decide to offer the unfair product, it has an externality of 60, a negative externality of 60 for the third party, but has no cost of production. As you see, it would be efficient for the buyers, sellers, and third parties. Overall efficiency would be to produce the fair product because the cost is much lower than the externality. Each seller can sell only 1 unit, and all the offers become common knowledge for the sellers. Okay, so the sellers first post the offers, and then the buyers enter into the market, okay? So it's a posted offer market. The sellers post the offers, and then buyers make the purchasing decision. So how the buyers enter the market? They enter sequentially in a random order that is determined every round. So every round they enter sequentially in a random order. And they observe the offers, the price, and the type of product that remain available. So basically the last consumer can only see 2 offers. And the buyer can buy one of the remaining products, but also not buying at all, okay? So how are you responsible? You can be responsible in 2 ways. One way is buying the fair product, but you can also be responsible if you don't buy any product. If you reject all the offers, the externality is not imposed to the third party, okay? So this would be an example. Instead of using your car when you go to work, you can go walking or in public transport, so you decide not to consume this good that has a negative externality to other people in your city, for example, the pollution. But the product have the same intrinsic value for the buyer, 50. Okay? And the payoffs of each of the 3 third parties is determined by each of the 3 potential market exchanges. Yeah.
These third parties, are these identical?
Did you describe them identical? Any of the third parties? You have also third parties, 3 third parties, right? Are they identical or are they different between themselves?
There are 4 sellers, 3 buyers, and 3 third parties. So 10 people in the market. Okay?
But there are no differences between like these third parties. For instance, one could be very, very rich, as an example, okay? Another could be from a developing country, so you will have more empathy, for example, or more, you know what I mean? So they are just...
They have the same. They have the same endowment. They start the experiment every round with the same endowment. Everybody, sellers, buyers, and third parties. This would be. We have another experiment where we change this, where we change the endowments. So if third parties are rich, you care more about third parties or not? But we didn't include this. That's a good question. We had actually another treatment where the third parties had more, but we didn't include in the paper. So there are 4 sellers, 4 buyers, and 4 sellers, 3 buyers, 3 third parties. And these are the payoffs, okay? The seller, this is the initial endowment, 100. So if you sell the product as a seller, 100 plus the price, if it's the unfair. But if it is the fair, you have to pay the 10 of costs. And if you don't sell any product, you have your endowment, 100. For the buyer, it is your endowment plus 50 minus the price that you pay for the product. And if you don't buy, if you decide not to buy to be responsible, it's 100, your endowment. And the third parties, if the transaction is socially responsible, so basically the fair good is traded or the buyer decides not to buy at all, the third party gets 100. But if the unfair good is traded, the externality is imposed and the third party only gets 40. So the third party is a person in the lab, okay? Any questions? So as you see, it is the buyer who decides. Obviously, the buyer faces different offers, but the buyer at the end, because it's a post-offer market, the buyer at the end is the one who decides if the transaction is fair or not fair, if it's socially responsible or not. Okay? So this is what I said before, like the identity stage. So before playing the market game, in part one, there's the identity stage where they solve this common solving problem task. And as I said, we have three treatments. The identity treatment, where buyers, sellers, and third parties in the market belong to the same team. Okay? Then we have the identity treatment out, where third parties belong to a different team than buyers and sellers. So basically, buyers and sellers belong to the same team, but we change third parties from the other team. So here we try to mimic, for example, as I said, buyers and sellers trade a good, and the third party is from the same team. So basically, the externality is in the same team. You buy local products. You decide to buy local products. And this different team of the third parties would mimic you decide to buy a fair trade product from Colombia. And then we have the baseline where no treatment, no identity is induced. But in order to be equivalent to here, the people have to solve the problem task, but individually. They don't have any team matching or any common solving, any chat, anything. They have to solve the problem of the paintings alone, okay, without communication.
Buyers and sellers don't suffer from any externality.
No.
I was thinking of the market and why unfair good. I mean, externality affects everybody. So,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that you internalize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the externality is if only one person. Yeah. Okay. Mm. That's a good question.
In the same way, in the examples that you indicated before, like environmentally friendly products, foods, and so on and so forth, externalities are being suffered by mainly the producer as well. So I was thinking, why have you thought about having always the third party when the externality could even be suffered by one of the parties or both parties? Is there a reason why the third party has to be there? Like, remember a class. I was saying that you could ask a different experiment in which you have a producer that if she doesn't get a fair price, she's suffering directly and cannot be compensated by the externality. Or the consumer, as my colleague said, why have you chosen this establishment in which you have this third party? Because, for example, if you think on fair trade, the externalities generated and suffered usually by the producer, right?
Yeah, but the producer causes the externality, but is not the one who suffers the externality.
In many markets, yeah.
But I think this is irrelevant, because it is an externality for the participants in the market. They don't care about the impact, so it's irrelevant.
Yeah, that's the point. They don't.
But it's not the producer causes the externality, but it's not the one who bears the externality.
That's true.
All bear the externality.
We want to identify when we move from identity treatment to identity treatment This is the identification you want, no? Because you are changing your experiment. And the question is, what do you want to identify in terms of social groups or social identity when you move, for example, from 1 to 2?
So basically, maybe I should change it, but the first thing I want to move from no identity to identity.
Yeah.
This is the main causal effect I want to see. What happened from 3 to 1. Okay, but also from 3 to 2 and from 1 to 2. But the main one is from no identity to induce identity.
Yes. And so there you identify when you move everything, nobody has an identity, and you go to everyone has an identity.
Yeah.
So what type of preferences do you identify? Preferences for homogeneity?
Yeah, so we study the causal impact on social responsibility. What is the share of fair products traded, for example, if it changes or not, if you have an identity. And also it will affect market prices. We will see it will affect market prices.
La comparación entre 1 y 2 también es interesante porque es como si mi externalidad afecta a los de mi grupo o a los que no son mi grupo, ¿no?
Por ejemplo, vamos a ver que si pasas de aquí a aquí, en determinados casos, porque la third party es de tu mismo equipo, sí que vas a comprar more socially responsible goods. Sin embargo, aquí no. Porque
realmente te da igual que haya ese tercer grupo o que pertenezca a tu grupo de buyers, porque, claro, o sea, para mí la comparación entre 1 y 2 tiene ese interés, identificar cómo cambia mi comportamiento cuando estoy afectando a alguien de mi grupo, aunque no sea buyer, sea tercera persona, frente a alguien que no está en mi grupo.
O que no haya, también que no tenga identity. So we are going to study the impact of this group identity on socially responsible behavior, also on market prices. It will be the more interesting because it will affect income inequality. So here is the evolution of the share of socially responsible outcomes across treatments. So socially responsible outcomes, remember, it's when the fair product is traded, but also when there's no trade, when the consumer decides not to consume. Okay. So here, if you compare these, there are no significant differences. Okay, in general. So the first result is not very nice, that social responsible overall is not affected by the identities, by ID or ID out. Even it's a bit lower, but it's not significantly different. And it's a bit lower because we will see later, the market prices will increase. Actually, the identity here will affect market prices, will increase market prices. But there's no significant difference. So basically is the fair product traded plus no trade, plus the buyer. Yeah, for example, here 70% means that 30% of the times the unfair good is traded, and the 70 is the fair good, or the consumer says, I don't buy the product because I don't want to impose the externality. Okay, so we see that basically we vary. This is the main paper that studied this, that we follow. It's basically the no ID treatment. So they find around 60% of the people in Nordic countries or in European countries decides to avoid externality. If they compare to China, and China would be around here in the experiment. That's their experiment. China, only like 20% of people avoid externality. So what happened? Imagine you are a consumer and you only face fair products. You are a consumer and you only face fair products. Can you be not responsible? Imagine all the firms decide to offer fair products. You are forced to be responsible, right? So group identities cannot affect your decision because you have to be socially responsible anyways, right? So what I do here is restrict the cases. In the model 1, we restrict the analysis where buyers face offers from both type of goods or only unfair goods. So basically, they are not forced to be responsible. Because if you only face fair products, you are forced to be responsible. So here, I consider only the cases where you face both type of products or only unfair products, okay? And we see that still is not significant, the identity treatments. It is significant, the dummy that considers that you face both products. So if you face both products, you are more likely to be responsible. Why? If you face only unfair products, it is very expensive for you as a buyer to be responsible. Why? Because you have to reject the offers and you lose the 50 of the value of the product. So to be socially responsible when you only face unfair products is very expensive, so people don't behave responsible. It's more likely that you behave responsible when you face both products. Okay. And here is the more interesting. In models 2 to 4, I restrict the analysis to observations when buyers observe both type of products. Okay, so you as a buyer, when you go to the market, you have offers for the fair and for the unfair. And in this case, the identity works. So you are more likely to, this is only for period 1. For period 1, you are more likely to be socially responsible if you share a common identity with sellers and third parties, if you are more likely to be socially responsible. But it works only in ID. In ID out, there's no significance. And here, the same, but with time periods, but we see that this positive significance is decreasing over time. We always see this in the experiments, that social identities decrease over time. So at the beginning of the experiment, you have a common belonging that is strong, but when the periods go on, you start to be less social responsible. The identities start to work less.
Because of experience, or in experimental setting in general?
I'm not sure.
Paper,
I think it's more like, okay, at the beginning you care more about the others, but then when you enter into a market, you start to be more selfish. Market erodes, there's many papers that talk about market eroding social responsibility. So they compare when you are in a market or when you are in a non-market environment, and people is more socially responsible in non-market environments than in market environments. So the market makes social responsibility to decrease over periods. Es un periodo y una persona, sí, pero está clustered por grupo de 10, sí. Sí. Por independent groups. Si no, claro, si no sería trampa hacerlo una y otra vez por grupo. No, esto es porque es solo el periodo 1. Solo tengo 8 grupos, de hecho, es difícil encontrar significance en experiencia. Si ya con 8 grupos encuentras esto, ya está bastante bien. No solo 8 grupos por treatment.
Y la diferencia entre que era mercado y no, porque the right to keep the Colorado Canyon in good condition, no say. It is a market.
Yeah, so for example, in an ultimatum game or in a dictator game where you share money with other people is more generous than in a market environment where there are buyers and sellers. Yeah. But here, we observe that if buyers face both type of products, fair and unfair, if they share a common identity with a third party, they behave socially responsible, more socially responsible, but it decreases over time. So it's not a very strong result, this first one. So the first result is that in the ID treatment, where everybody shares the same identity, the share of fair products traded initially is higher, but only when buyers face offers from both types of products. Okay? And this effect vanishes over time, goes down over time. But the more interesting that we didn't expect in the experiment is the effect on market prices. That is very clear here. So with no identities, so first notice that there is competition. It's a type of Bertrand game with 4 sellers and 3 buyers. So there's market forces here. But actually in the ID is like that. But when introduced identities, the market prices for the fair product increased. So why this happened? So what happened is that buyers and sellers were trying to reduce their inequality, their income inequality. So basically, because sellers have less profits than buyers. So what happened is that sellers asked for a higher price and buyers accepted this higher price, actually. So they reduce inequality through market prices. I will explain more later. And if you see ID and ID out, the identity of buyers and sellers is the same in both, because we varied the identity of the third parties here. But these 2 treatments, in terms of buyers and sellers, is the same. They share the same identity. So we see that identities increase market prices for the fair product. And the same for the unfair product. The same for the unfair product. So market prices are significantly higher in the identity treatments, regardless of the type of product. And therefore the price premium, so the price premium is the difference between the price for the fair and the unfair product, does not vary. Okay, so why market prices increased? And here we see the explanation. So we have the evolution of the sellers and the buyers' income. Here is sellers and here is buyers. You see that buyers have higher profits than sellers. This is above. Okay? So what they are, and why? Obviously because there's market forces. So sellers, they have to compete to sell the product to the buyers. There are 4 sellers and 3 buyers. Okay? So what happened? The sellers increased market prices because they say, okay, I'm in your same, I have the same identity than you. My income is lower. I have the right, let's say, to have a bit more of the pie. And actually, sellers accepted so this is the idea of when you buy a local product to a local shop. Usually it is more expensive, right, to buy the product in a local shop than buying in Amazon. And if you share this common group identity, you see that sellers ask for a higher price and actually buyers accept it. So sellers increase their income, buyers decrease their income at the beginning. But this is also very interesting. At the end, if you see, the income is the same in the identity treatments. And why is so? Because if you consider the no identity treatment, if you see the offer rejections, they are 8.3% of the times buyers reject all the offers in the no identity treatments. But if you go to the identity treatments, the offer rejections are reduced to less than 2%. So we see here an improvement in efficiency. Identities made buyers and sellers to trade more efficiently. The buyers reject less often the offers. And that's why we see here an increase in income of the sellers in the identity treatments, because the market prices increased, but the buyers, at the beginning, they lost something, but they reached the same income. So this is not significantly different across treatments. So actually, sellers increased their income, but buyers did not decrease their income. So the total income of buyers and sellers increases in the identity treatments. There's an improvement in efficiency due to identities. So that's the same. The next result. Average seller's income is higher in the identity treatments, but buyer's income does not differ across treatments. Why? Because they did reject less the offers. When you reject an offer, you are losing the gains of trade. The 50 you are losing, so it's very inefficient to reject all the offers. So we find an improvement in efficiency. The total income of buyers and sellers is higher in the identity treatments. So there is less conflict, let's say. When you don't share the same identity, there is more conflict in the terms that you don't like the offers of the sellers and you reject all. If you have common identity, there's less conflict and you accept more the offers. And even higher prices, you accept even higher prices. And just to the last result is about inequality. We saw it from the previous graph, but in a regression, I consider the coefficient of variation. That is the most simple measure of inequality. I also in the appendix have the Gini coefficient. I did also for the Gini coefficient. What is the inequality between buyers and sellers? And it is clear that income inequality between buyers and sellers is reduced when they share the same identity through prices, right? So group identities affect a lot inequality between buyers and sellers. In the second, I compare ID and ID out. So basically here is ID versus ID out. We see that inequality is reduced even more in the ID out. So when buyers and sellers share a common identity that is different than the third party, the inequality between buyers and sellers is even reduced more. And finally, I measure the inequality of buyers and sellers versus third parties. So basically, imagine buyers and sellers are from the same country. So the inequality between country A, that is buyers and sellers, versus country B, that is the third party from another country. And we see that income inequality is increased. And why? Because buyers and sellers increase their income, because the efficiency is increased in the transactions, but this does not affect the third party. The third party does not benefit from the increase of buyers and sellers. So actually, third parties, the inequality of buyers and sellers versus third parties is increased in the identity out treatment. So this is the fourth result. Income inequality among buyers and sellers is lower in the identity treatments, but if we compare buyers and sellers versus third parties are worse off. Their inequality is higher. So just to conclude, so how to summarize the result? So first, overall, inducing group identities, unfortunately, does not affect the aggregate level of social responsibility, but it affects, group identity affects the degree of social responsibility when buyers face offers from both types of products, okay? So one policy implication here would be that the government should ensure that buyers have a variety of products in the market. So if consumers have a variety of products in the market, basically the fair and unfair, when they have a group identity, they behave more socially responsible. But group identities that we didn't expect have a greater and more persistent impact on market prices. And why? Because through market prices, buyers and sellers reduce their income inequality. So income inequality, the main conclusion is that the identities work better between buyers and sellers when they are trading than to the third parties. And group identity improves the efficiency. So basically between buyers and sellers, it improves a lot the efficiency in the transactions. It reduces inequality. So that's all. Thank you. Now we have some minutes if you want to ask something.
Is that multiplication, the whole, a key part of the accordance with Akerlof-Lemons paper. Imagine a market for cars. The price will be the price of the lemon. But if we reduce the problem to the community, a close community, and there is a trust, the price should be much more higher. And the third parties, that will be other people that are not informed about the car, then another third party will have incentive to sell lemons because the lemon is cheaper, and you can the effect in the lab will be that the third party will pay more than the price of the lemon because the others.
Otro ejemplo que pondría es, por ejemplo, en Noruega, si vas a tomar un café, bueno, en Noruega los levels of trust comparado con España son mucho más altos y culturalmente son muy homogéneos, mucho más que en España. Y yo que sé, un café en Noruega cuesta 5 euros y en España cuesta 1, ¿no? Y también, ¿por qué? Porque los salarios, la desigualdad en Noruega, un camarero en Noruega gana prácticamente lo mismo que un profesor de universidad. Sin embargo, en España hay mucha desigualdad y es una de las ideas de por qué quise introducir group identities, cuál es el efecto en precios y en social responsibility.
Mira, yo tengo un pequeño problema con la identidad de grupo. No acabo de entenderlo muy bien porque de tu resultado lo que no entiendo es que no hay diferencia, o aparentemente, si lo he entendido bien, entre que los terceros, los que reciben la externalidad, pertenezcan o no al grupo. ¿Vale? Porque no hay diferencia. Entonces,
no. En social responsibility. No.
Entonces, esto parece que, bueno, si yo me siento en un grupo, según tu resultado, si yo me siento en un grupo, me da igual que vaya a recibir el impacto negativo. Entonces, esto me hace dudar de cómo cómo en tu experimento estás generando esta identidad de grupo.
Sí. No, porque esta identidad de grupo funcionó mucho mejor en términos de precios y desigualdad entre consumidores y productores que en la third party. Pero, sin embargo, sí funcionó también entre consumidores y sí funcionó cuando... El problema es que hay muchas situaciones donde solo hay fair products. Entonces, da igual la identidad. El consumidor tiene que ser socially responsible. Entonces, si restringes los casos donde tienen la opción de no ser socially responsible, donde tienen los dos tipos de productos, ahí sí que funciona. En ID out no es significativo. El baseline aquí es sin identities. El baseline es sin identities aquí. Entonces, si comparas sin identities con identities, aquí sí sube, pero aquí no. Pero sí es verdad que no funcionó tan bien. A lo mejor el diseño está un poco mal porque hay muchas situaciones donde el consumidor, si tú solo ves fair products, da igual las identities. Tú tienes que... Entonces, pero si restringes, cuando ves los dos tipos de products, ahí sí que funcionan las identities.
debería intervenir, lograr que el sender internalice la externalidad de producir un non-for price y entonces todo produce. Si el gobierno tiene una responsabilidad, el gobierno puede intervenir. Si interviene el gobierno, yo lo que haría es un impuesto a lo que producen.
Sí. Pero, por ejemplo, en general la competencia, las organizaciones de competencia prohíben este tipo. Por ejemplo, cuando yo vivía en Holanda había un debate sobre los pollos, sobre orgánicos y no orgánicos, que era muy barato el pollo no orgánico y por las condiciones de vida. Y las cadenas de supermercados se pusieron de acuerdo para solo ofrecer el fair product, el pollo orgánico. Y la organización de la competencia de Holanda dijo que no, que eso era ilegal, que los consumidores tenían derecho a la competencia y si querían coger el pollo barato tenían el derecho. Y cosas así. O también sobre neveras, hay otros casos sobre neveras que las compañías de frigoríficos se ponen de acuerdo que vamos a solo ofertar fair products y eso lo prohíben las sí, es un acuerdo colisivo. Si es el gobierno es diferente. Sí. En este caso sí, porque sería eficiente, debería hacerlo porque es eficiente, ¿no? Porque los costes son mucho menores que la externalidad, pero siempre hay intereses en los gobiernos, a lo mejor sí. Si el gobierno le importa más el buyer seller porque la third party está en otro lado, pues a lo mejor no, el gobierno no quiere intervenir. No sé.
Pues, moitísimas gracias, Francisco, polo teu seminario. Seguindo un pouco o comentario que facía Jaime, xa para concluir, o do third party, isto, me parece moi interesante, porque é realmente o que sucede nos mercados actualmente. É un pouco who cares, non? Quen sufre a externalidade. E é un pouco que ti demostras que realmente a conciencia de grupo, a identidade de grupo non importa moito, porque non se ten en consideración quen finalmente sufre a externalidade.
No funciona tanto. Porque los papers, yo dije antes que yo contribuía a la literatura en los determinantes de social responsible behavior y los papers en general no encuentran diferencias significativas cuando varían las cosas. Es decir, que este 70% que vi aquí es muy difícil variarlo en los experimentos. Es bastante robust, es bastante robusto.
Cuando yo pienso en estas cosas, yo pienso en la disposición a pagar.
Es que
esta responsabilidad social se trata de vivir como las veces que compras un bien fair o fair, y no más. ¿Cuánto estoy dispuesto a pagar más por este bien que es fair o no fair? Eso lo tienes en tus experimentos, ¿no? Porque los precios se deciden.
Por lo que se ve aquí, estás más dispuesto a pagar cuando hay una transacción. Sin embargo, si la third party no está en la transacción, no estás tan dispuesto a pagar.
O por lo que te piden.
Sí.
Si te había más esto como medida de la responsabilidad social, ¿cuánto porque el consumidor paga el mismo precio por los dos? Bueno, no. Para él valora el mismo, los bienes para él es el mismo bien. Entonces está dispuesto a pagar más por ese bien porque tiene una responsabilidad social.
Bueno, pues si no hay más preguntas, concluimos aquí. Muchísimas gracias. El próximo jueves será jueves, porque va a ser festivo. Tenemos una Roland que desde la Universidad de Barcelona pues, nos contará un proyecto muy interesante. Así que muchísimas gracias y hasta el próximo.